Hello, and welcome to another episode of your Bish Therapist podcast. I am your host, Melissa Reich, aka your Bish Therapist. I am a real life therapist turned pop culture enthusiast here to serve clinical interpretations and hot takes on all things pop culture. Today's episode is going to be about Mary Cosby and her family. For those of you who follow me on Instagram, you know that Mary Cosby really activates me. And for those of you who are maybe listeners and you don't follow me on social media, what I that's what I call it when I get activated by something. The social justice warrior in me, or there are things that happen that I watch on Bravo and on TV that they just activate me. I just really get frustrated. And Mary Cosby is one of those people. And I made some posts about it on my Instagram page, You're a Bish Therapist, on Instagram, YOURBISH Therapist. And, a listener suggested, why don't you do an episode about it? And I thought, you know what? I should. So here we are. So today's episode, of course, has my signature deep dives. I have done a ton of research about the family tree. So I'm going to give you all a breakdown of the Cosby family tree. I'm going to talk specifically about, in addition to the people involved, I'm going to talk about certain allegations. I have two sources of information that I listened to prior to this podcast, and I'm going to share with you what that is. I'm, of course, going to give my signature clinical interpretations, but I also love a good timeline. So I'm going to give a timeline of all the events surrounding Mary and her grandmother and her step grandfather, aka her husband. And of course, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, I'm going to explain who Mary is and why the situation is so wild. So let's get right into it. So for those of you who don't know, Mary Cosby is a woman who became one of the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. So the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City is a relatively new franchise that came on the scene 4 years ago. So it's in its fourth season right now. Okay. So Mary Cosby was on season 1 and 2 of the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, and she was fired after not showing up to the reunion after season 2. And that's important, and I'm going to share why. So she was fired for not attending the reunion, so she was not present for season 3. And then they went ahead and decided to bring her back for the season 4. And that is what really irritates me. So for those who don't watch Housewives and don't know, if you part of your contractual obligation to be a housewife is to participate in filming, and it is also to attend reunions. And I think, was it Adrienne Maloof was the first housewife to not show up to a reunion and get fired. And so I don't know if this whole clause was because of her, but the rule is if you don't fulfill your contractual obligations, it is a job, you get fired. So Mary didn't show up to the reunion, gets fired, and they bring her back. What? And also, all of these allegations that I'm going to share with you today are going to give you pause, or should give you pause, in terms of why did they bring this person back, period. Because there's a lot of rumors and allegations about, cults and, possibly murder, and a lot of these really scary, dysfunctional accusations or allegations are being thrown towards Mary. So that all doesn't make sense. But the last reason why it doesn't make sense is because for anybody who's actually watched it, Mary is participating zero in the season. Literally hanging out on the bus, just refusing to go to things, eating a fillet of fish in the truck or the Sprinter van, and then judging other people for what they eat. She's just, for me, Mary is a really problematic person, and it frustrates me as to why Bravo is continuing to feature her, and her situation with her husband slash step grandfather. So I'm going to explain that for a minute for those of you who aren't familiar with the situation. So Mary Cosby is married to her step grandfather. So I'm going to explain this family tree. Okay, bear with me. So Rosemary Cosby, aka Mama Cosby, that's what I'm going to call her because that's what people did call her, Mama Cosby. She is the grandmother of Mary, and Rosemary Mama Cosby is the mother to Mary's mother. Okay. So she is the mother to 4 children. And I did do a deep dive about some of the sibling birth orders. So Mary has aunts and uncles on her mom's side. So there was Pamela, Rosie, who is Mary's mother. Rosie, her name is Rosalind, but they call her Rosie. So I'm going to respect that. Rosie, Ernie, and Debbie. Okay, so those are Mary Cosby's aunts and uncle, and Rosemary Cosby's, aka Mama Cosby's, children. I'm sorry. So then Rosie Cazares, is Mary's mother. And there was a very interesting interview on YouTube, and I'm going to post it. So when this podcast releases, I'm going to post the link to the interview on my social media, because it was so Rosalind Cazares and Mark Cazares. Mark Cazares is married to Rosalind. He is Mary's stepfather. I couldn't find a lot of information about Mary's biological father. However, I am a huge fan of family doesn't have to be blood. And so this man was in her life since she was young. And by all accounts, it seems like he's really been a father figure to her. So Rosie and Mark Cazares, her parents, and then there's Mary, and then the other person two other people that are important to the story, Robert Cosby Sr. So Robert Cosby Sr. was married to Mama Cosby for years and years and years. And I'm going to discuss this when I talk about the timeline. Okay. So Robert Cosby married Mama Cosby. He was 22 years her junior, and they got married in 1975. Okay. So keep in mind, while Mary was growing up, the man that she eventually married, she knew to be her step grandfather since she was little. So, that's interesting and wild. I want to be mindful of how I talk about this because, there's a lot of sensitive subjects involved, but it's just kind of that's the thing that everyone clings on to with Mary, because it's bizarre, right? You grow up with this man married to your grandmother. He is not your blood relation, but you know him as your step grandfather, and being married to your grandmother and participating in the church that Mary grew up in. So it just feels icky. I think it just feels icky for a lot of people. And I'm going to, talk about that more in just a bit. So after Mama Cosby died under very suspicious circumstances, Mary married Robert, her step grandfather, and they eventually had a child. His name is Robert Cosby Jr. So Mary's husband is Robert Cosby Sr. Her son is Robert Cosby Jr. Okay. And I have some information about Robert Cosby Jr. as well. And then the last person is Annie Lois Johnson. Her name kept popping up because she owns one of the major assets that were talked about in the court filings and things like that. So she ran the mortgage company, and I'm going to get to this. Bear with me because it's a lot of information. It's a little confusing. Annie Lewis Johnson is a name that kept popping up in my research because she ran a mortgage company that was Mama Cosby created. And Annie Lewis Johnson ran that company, and there have been allegations that that company was used to assist church members to remortgage their homes and donate it to the church. Very shady. So you're going to hear me talk about her from time to time. So going back to the family tree for a second. So Robert Cosby Jr., Mary's son, the reason why I'm going to talk about this is it was just featured on The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, which, by the way, I have stopped watching because Mary, her behavior frustrates me to no end. And it also irritates me that Bravo is just putting, like, there are lots of people out there, I'm sure, who want to be on TV. We can't come up with anyone better who's a willing participant, who's at least takes pride in what they're doing. I mean, anything. It just frustrates me. So the last teaser for the episode showed that Mary, what she lives with her son. Okay. She lives with her son. She lives with her husband. And it appears that they all live in different rooms, wings, whatever you want to call it. Mary's room, she is just like a hoarder of designer goods. I mean, sincerely, anyone who has seen her closet, it's not a nice closet. It's her entire room is just hoarded designer goods. She literally surrounds herself with stuff because I think stuff makes Mary feel valuable, because I don't think she feels valuable inside. But I also think she has this materialistic piece of her that and honestly, I kind of think she sold her soul for stuff. And I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit. But so Mary was giving this interview about how she thought her son was married, but she didn't get a chance to talk to him yet. They live in the same house. So I was like, that tells me a lot about where Mary's at and her level of communication. I mean, okay, fine, fair enough. If you thought your son or your child or whatever was married and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know about this, fine, fair enough. But then, like, get up and go ask them. Like, it took her weeks to go and like film with her son and to ask him about him getting married. And he admitted that he is married. It's just the whole situation seems so strange and bizarre. So Mary's son, Robert Cosby Jr., he was charged on February 19th, 2022. He and Mary were both charged, by the way, with 2 misdemeanor counts of providing shelter to a runaway and contributing to delinquency of a minor. So Mary and Robert Cosby Jr. were charged with that, and the charges for both were dropped due to witness issues. So what's fascinating to me about this is that I wonder if this is the minor that we're talking about here with Robert marrying her. Was she under the age of 18 and then she turned 18 and then they got married? I'm going to do more of a deep dive on that because I couldn't really figure that out, but that would be my guess at this point, right? So Mary and Robert get in trouble for having this young woman, I believe. I think he said he married a female. I don't know. I'm not totally sure about that. I don't ever want to assume anybody's straight. And so that's just why I'm being cautious. But I think he said it was a young woman. So he's married. Okay. Mary has no idea. And then there's this issue with, the minor, and, I'm just going to go ahead and assume that maybe he married her to prevent any more charges or any more issues. I mean, he's 21 years old, if she's 18, 18-year-olds and 21-year-olds have a lot more in common than you'd think because our brains, fun fact, they don't stop developing until age 25. So I truly believe that ages 21 to 25, they're essentially teenagers too. So I think while, legally it's above board if she's above 18 and he's 21, but it also seems like a product of his environment, meaning that he is seems maybe a little emotionally immature the way that he was talking to Mary about this. He kind of seemed like a little kid who was just like afraid to say anything, and he was afraid to be honest about it. But it's like, you're 21 years old and you got married and you can't have this conversation with your mom. So I just think that what I've seen from the family dynamic is that there's a lot of dysfunction. There's a huge lack of communication. There is a lack of emotional intelligence and emotional maturity, for sure. So, but I will say, it seems like Mary loves her son dearly. So I'll give her some credit for that, because being a mom doesn't mean, you love your child or you treat them well. There's plenty of parents who, are unfortunately abusive and things like that. So I will give Mary that. Okay. So now let's talk about the two bits of information, the two not bit I got information from two sources. So the Bravo Docket, shout out to the Bravo Docket ladies if you're listening or if you're watching. The Bravo Docket ladies, for those of you listening, if you're not familiar with who they are, they're amazing. They're lawyers who talk about the legal side of things. They talked about, so they did this episode, it's called So I Married My Grandpa, and married is spelled Mary, and it aired on 4/2021, but they re-released it on 9/2023, in light of Mary coming back and her being on TV. So hello to Sassy and Angela. If you don't know who they are, please check them out. They're on the Bravo Docket on Instagram. And then they're also have a podcast where you can find anywhere podcasts are available. I highly recommend, if you're listening to this podcast, I recommend you listen to theirs, because they talk about the legal side of everything I'm about to share. And I did get their permission to, share some of the stuff that they shared as well, because, as a content creator, I don't want to step on toes and I respect them a whole lot. So, and the other piece of information that I took in, it was a YouTube video interview with Up and Adam. So it's Up and Adam ! He interviewed Mary's mom and stepdad. And that was about a 45-minute interview. And it was so fascinating to me because you got to see Mary's mom and stepdad. And it was about a 45-minute interview, and it was very eye-opening. So everything that I'm talking about today, all the information that I obtained was through those two sources. I recommend you listen to them both. I will share links to those in my social media when this episode comes out. So, okay. So now let's go over the timeline first, and then I'm going to share some specific information that has come out in some of these interviews and podcasts. Okay. So in 1975, Mama Cosby marries Robert Cosby, who is 22 years her junior. Okay. Then in December of 1988, we're going to jump all the way to December of 1988. Annie Lois Johnson was listed as CEO of the mortgage lending company affiliated with the church. And that's important because that's going to come up in some legal filings. And also, to be clear, when Mama married Robert Cosby, she had the church and she had integrated him into the church. And by the way, the church that we're talking about is called Faith Temple Pentecostal Church. That is going to be the church if you want to look it up. It is in Salt Lake City and it is now closed. It closed actually on January 2022, which the interesting thing about this is it closed the month before the reunion aired. And I think what's fascinating about that is that, so Mary didn't show up to the reunion. And I think it has a lot to do with, she just didn't want to answer questions about the church, because the church was really being questioned, like on the show. They had people coming onto the show to talk about being, taken advantage of and things like that. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But that church is now closed. So Mama Cosby has this church. She marries Robert Cosby and she makes him bishop of the church. So people call Robert Cosby Sr. bishop. Okay, so then we're going to jump to January 3rd, 1997. This is where things get wild. Mama Cosby dies suddenly in Florida under suspicious circumstances. So, according to everyone and everything that I have read and watched, Mama Cosby had no health issues. She was on no medications, and she died suddenly, apparently of heart issues. Now, guess what? There was never an autopsy done initially, which I find so strange, is that Robert Sr. told police that she had high blood pressure and had heart issues, and that's what she died from. And I guess they just took his word for it. I was like, what? Oh my gosh. And it was found that she was taking no medication for any of those issues. So here's the thing. Is it possible to have heart-related issues and not know that you have them? Sure it is. But for police to just, isn't that so misogynistic? It's like, could you imagine a woman saying, oh, my husband died from this, and no one looking into it more? No, that would never happen. But of course, Robert Cosby Sr. is just like, oh, she died from heart issues. And everyone's like, oh, okay, chief, we'll put that in the books. And it's like, oh, give me a break. So that was her death on January 3rd, 1997, literally started events that would change the landscape of this family forever. Seriously, forever. But the rest of this timeline is wild and very important. Okay. So on February 11th, 1997, literally 1 month and 1 week after his wife dies, Robert Sr. files an application for appointment as personal representative of the estate of Rosemary Cosby. Of course, Bravo Docket ladies. I got that information from them. So thanks, ladies. But what that essentially means is Mama Cosby died and she had a huge empire that she built sincerely from nothing. The lore with Mama Cosby is that she grew up in Indiana and she and her kids walked to Salt Lake City to start their church. And so she was a self-made woman who she really built herself up from nothing with 4 kids and, no partner to help her. The walking from Indiana to Salt Lake seems super unsafe and concerning, but I think this was in the 60s when maybe you could do that. I don't know. And it's just what I've read and what I've heard, but who knows if that's true. But the point is this is a woman who by all accounts was an amazing woman. She was a true spiritual leader. She was truly trying to build something for herself and her community. And I did not come across one bad word about Mama Cosby, to be super clear, in all of this. By all accounts, she was an amazing woman. So she built all of this up. And you know what? While we're here, let me tell you exactly what she built. Okay. So she built the Faith Temple Pentecostal Church, which again closed in 2022. She had 2 restaurants. Those are also now closed. She had a radio station that is currently closed. She had this mortgage company run by Annie Lois Johnson. And that is the only thing I'm not totally sure about, if that is still active or not. Question mark on that. They also had a daycare center, and I do know that the daycare center got money in the pandemic, like a PPE loan. I think that's what it's called, during the pandemic, but I am unsure if that is still open as well. I want to say I think it's defunct. And so her assets, Mama Cosby's assets, totaled over $1.2 million. She had 5 homes, she had cars, she had jewelry, she had art. So her estate was huge. absolutely huge, especially for this family where she really seemed to break cycles of generational trauma and financial issues, because she had her family set up really, really nicely, and it seemed like she did share a lot of her success with those around her. So those are the assets that are in question. Okay. So after Robert Sr. he wanted to take charge of the assets because he wanted the assets, right? I mean, that's just really clear. And then on 8/3/1998, there was a court hearing regarding Mama's estate due to allegations of hiding assets. A restraining order was filed to prevent Robert from selling or transferring property. So what Rosalind Razi Cesaris, Mary's mother, was alleging is that he and Annie Lois Johnson were conspiring to hide assets, to try to say, well, this property isn't Mama's estate, it's mine, or this thing isn't part of her estate, it's mine. So, one thing I'll say about Mary's mom, Rosie, is she also seems to be an amazing woman who is just advocating for herself and for her family. And she seems to be a sincerely amazing class act as well. And I'm going to talk more about her in a bit when I talk about this specific interview that was done. Okay, so this is why this is so shady and super important. So as I just mentioned, 1998, there was this court hearing that they're alleging Robert of hiding assets, and the court order blocked him from being able to do that. Okay, are we ready for this? Then in September of 1998, not 1 month later, Mary and Robert Cosby Sr. marry. They marry. He is 45 and she is 25. And guess what? Here's a little fun fact that I've never heard anybody talk about, is that Mary was married. So Mary apparently was married to a gentleman named Dana, and they married when she was 17, which, throws up some flags for me, because when you're 17, I'm going to say confidently, we shouldn't be marrying anybody, because for so many reasons. At 17, you're a child, you don't know what you want yet, you're young, your brain isn't fully developed, those prefrontal cortexes here don't develop finally until we're 25. And it just seems like an interesting dynamic that not only was Mary allowed to get married, but apparently Mama Cosby officiated the ceremony, and all of her family were behind the marriage. So I think that's just an interesting point in terms of like the generational piece of this, right? So here we are seeing Robert Jr. getting married really young and maybe not totally thinking things through. So that's something interesting that, I have to do a little bit more of a deep dive into, but I just found that fascinating. So Mary was married to this man named, both allege that Robert, once he was unsuccessful in obtaining all of Mama's assets because the court kept blocking him, they allege that he manipulated and brainwashed Mary into marrying him so that she could essentially be the heir, and then they could keep the stuff that they were looking to keep. It's just so, and the evidence is so damning. I mean, the court hearing for it was a month before they decided to get married. I mean, you cannot tell me Mary is 25 years old, she's married, and you're telling me that she wanted to marry the man that she has looked at her as her step grandfather? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. And so then in January of 2005, there was a civil case where the jury found Robert Sr. guilty of forgery and awarded the estate of Mama Cosby $1.2 million in damages. So what does that mean? Okay. So it was a civil case. It wasn't a criminal case. But there was this long story about Mama didn't have a will, which we all have to have wills. This is such a good lesson in, if you have something and you're building something for your family, get a will so things like this don't happen. It's just a good idea. Nobody wants to think about that, but like, we got to protect ourselves and our family, because look at what has happened here with all of this. I can't help but think if Mama Cosby had a will, none of this would have happened, but that's just, I'm just assuming. So they did find out that Robert had fraudulently, there was Mama Cosby's signature on some quitclaim deeds of properties and things like that. And it was notarized, but it turns out the notary lied. The notary wasn't really there, didn't really see who signed it. It was just a really shady thing. And so the court did find Robert and Mary guilty of forgery. And so I don't know in terms of if the Caesaris and the rest of the family will see that money, but they were ordered to pay $1.2 million that they believed was hidden in assets. Now, here's the wild thing. Mary's parents, and I'm going to go into that interview in a little bit, but they believe sincerely that Robert Sr. murdered Mama Cosby. They believe that. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying that that's what they believe. They said it in this interview multiple times. And so again, Rosie really has been championing and advocating for her mom, for Mama, for her family. Despite what Mary's done, she really still advocates, which is, she just must be a very loving woman. But in August of 1999, because of Rosie Caesaris's belief that her mom was murdered by Robert, the judge ordered an exhumation and an autopsy, because remember, there wasn't an autopsy done. It was just like, oh, she died of heart issues. Let's just leave it at that. Ugh. So the autopsy did it did confirm that she died of heart failure, and natural causes of death were determined once again. But Rosie remains steadfast that this doesn't make any sense. So, there's a part of me where it's like, well, is this grief that's preventing her from, maybe accepting that sometimes we don't know that we have medical conditions, and then unfortunately we pass away? Or, there are tons of things. I'm a true crime junkie, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this, are into that as well. And we all know that there's things that people can do or ingest or whatever to make things, to have alarm bells not go off. I mean, I've watched enough shows to know that. So I'm not making any allegations. I'm just saying. But so that is kind of the last piece of the timeline that's really important. So now I want to go on to specifically what some of my observations from the YouTube interview with Mary's parents, because wow, it was a wild ride. I have so many notes here. So the first observation that I have is that if you have to go look at this interview, if you don't want to watch it, just go look at it, for the simple fact that Mary's mother looks and sounds identical to Mary. Like, it is so creepy. Identical. They look the same. They sound the same. Now, the one thing is, Mary's mom wore these huge, very dark sunglasses the entire interview, which, fine. When you're doing an interview, sometimes there's very bright lights, and maybe she's sensitive to that, or maybe, I don't know, maybe she just didn't want her eyes to be seen. I have no idea. But despite the dark glasses, she looks and sounds just like Mary. It is such a trip. The thing that I observed is that Mary's parents appeared genuinely loving, kind, wonderful people, and they genuinely love Mary, despite the fact that Mary's actions caused repercussions that splintered the family irreparably. So essentially what happened is when Mary, they were all part of the same church, okay? So when Mama Cosby died, the church was huge. Mary's parents and her all her extended family, they were all a part of this church, okay? So when Mary and Robert Cosby Sr. decided to marry, it completely fractured the church. So Mary's parents did not agree. There were 400 church members that also did not agree. So what happened was Mary's actions splintered the church. About 400 people literally left and went with Mary's parents to their own church. They started their own church in Salt Lake City because, and listen, I give them a lot of credit for this. They have enough ethical and moral obligation they were like, we're not standing by this marriage. We don't believe in it. We believe that, they were really clear that they believe Robert Sr. brainwashed Mary, and they believe that, Mary just made a mistake and that Mary is a victim. They really held that stance throughout the entire interview, which I just thought is so loving in terms of they love Mary enough to say, well, we think you're a victim. And, a little later, I'm going to talk about victim versus participant, because whether she's a victim or not, that remains to be seen. However, I just am taken aback by the love that they really truly had for Mary, despite the fact that, okay, so the church splintered and separated, okay, and they haven't talked to their own daughter in 20 years because they say that she is, they are prevented from having contact with Mary. In fact, after Mama Cosby died, and after Mary and Robert Cosby Sr. got married, they weren't even allowed at the services. Robert Cosby somehow got police to say, that they'd be arrested, that Rosie and Mark Cazares would be arrested if they came to the church, which is just like, this is her mother that just died. And so that tells me everything I need to know about Robert, for sure. They say that he's a dangerous man. He's not someone to be messed with. And I agree with that assessment. That is a low down, disgusting thing to not allow Mama's children to be present at the service. So I find that very interesting. But they believe, the thing that frustrates me is that while they're loving and they believe that Mary's a victim, they did seem to make a lot of excuses for her. They said that Robert used Mary's young materialistic desires to lure her into this life. So essentially, they really said that Mary was a spoiled brat and she liked nice things, and she essentially sold her soul for stuff. But that's a Mary decision, So I just think that, Mary might be a victim, but she, at this age and at this point, is certainly a participant in some way, shape, or form. You've seen her, on Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. They showed her at her church. They showed her, she said that she allowed her congregants to believe that she is the facsimile of God. Yeah. Let that sink in for a minute. She allowed her congregants, parishioners, whatever you want to call them, to believe that she's a facsimile of God. That is insanity. That to me is cult-like in terms of wanting congregants to believe that God is talking to you directly, or you are. That doesn't, that kind of behavior is really, really concerning because, the fact of the matter is that Mary is not a facsimile of God. And in fact, she has zero humanity. And this is part of the reason that I get really frustrated with her is that, I am tired of people in religious or spiritual positions of power taking advantage. I'm just not here for that. I'm going to talk about religious and spiritual abuse in just a second. But I think that allowing people to believe that you are a facsimile of God, that is can be harmful, because she isn't, and she lacks humanity. So the point that I'm getting to there is that I'm tired of people in religious positions of power having no humanity, but calling themselves a spiritual leader. To be a spiritual leader, you have to have a level of humanity. And what is the level of humanity? Kindness, respect, treating others the way you want to be treated, like real basic things that we learn in like kindergarten. Mary displays none of that. Mary is incredulous. She is rude. She is unkind, isn't even the word for it. She's just downright nasty. She's judgmental. Mary has made racist comments on TV about Mexican Americans being thugs and black people, just like all of these really harmful stereotypes about the Black community, about the Mexican community. And I've had people reach out that were very hurt by it. And you should be hurt. All of this is the reason that I'm like, I don't understand what Bravo is doing here. It's not just like Mary has this history with her husband. That's weird enough. But what she gives on camera is just nastiness. She is rude. Oh, and she body shames. The body shaming of Heather Gay when she made the comment about how she didn't know Gucci made a corset in size 14 was just gross and body shaming at its finest. So Mary, let me put it this way. If she is a facsimile of God, well, I don't know what that means about what people believe God is, because that's that's all I'm going to say about that. It's just insane. So going back to the interview with the Cesaris family, they are very clear that they believe that Robert Sr. is running a cult, and they believe that he brainwashed Mary and murdered Mama and all of these things. But they will not hold Mary accountable for any decisions that she's made. And so, I think that's really harmful because, Mary participates in things as much as she wants to. So I think that we can't, when we love someone, sometimes we're quick to take consequences or to take accountability away from them because we love them, but that's not super helpful either. And then the other thing that I found was interesting is that Rozzy claims that Robert has a huge ego and that his role in the church fueled his ego, which led to allegations of a sex addiction. Claimed that Mama herself told Rozzy that Robert Sr. had some sort of a sex addiction. Robert Sr. made some really inappropriate comments to Rozzy when she was younger about her body and things like that. And again, these are allegations. This is what Rozzy's saying. I tend to believe her. But, I think that part of it is really interesting too, because I think that leads them to feel like Mary is more of a victim as well. But they also claim that Mary never wanted to marry Robert. Like, everyone agrees that Mary didn't want to marry this man, but she did it because they believe that she did it because she was manipulated and because she was materialistic and all those things. But guess what? She still did it. I mean, it was, she has to have some sort of accountability in this at some point. And they claim that and this is a direct quote, they claim that the church is night and day different after Mama died. So I want to be really clear about that because, religious, practices, they can be wonderful and churches can be amazing. So apparently under Mama, this church was amazing. It really, she served the community. She served her parishioners. She really was a tireless public servant. But after Mama died, they said under Robert, quote, the church is a cult. He's dangerous, end quote. Yikesers. So that is their view on it. And to be honest, who am I to argue with their perspective? Perspective is reality. And the evidence, so hearing and learning about all of this stuff and then putting together what we've seen on TV, it kind of really does paint a picture, doesn't it? That, something nefarious happened, or is happening, and things changed and they aren't like they used to. In fact, the saddest thing I think is that all of Mama Cosby's legacies and businesses, they're all defunct now. And, I think what's frustrating is that when, a good person starts to do great things and then not so great people take over, her legacy really just kind of like, petered out. And that I think is really sad because she worked really hard for that. But, for those of you who watch Salt Lake City, remember when I said that Mary and Robert, they have 5 homes? Well, Mary bragged about this on the show, saying they have five homes and they don't share. So they don't rent them out. They don't share. And it's like, well, how much of a spiritual leader can you be if you're like, I'm hoarding properties and I'm hoarding designer goods and I love my husband because he buys me Chanel. And it's just like, I think that Mary is profoundly unhappy and she sold her soul for stuff. I'm going to say it again. I believe that is the case. And now she's miserable and she's unhappy and she takes it out on everybody else. But she is a participant in the decisions that she made, right? So now let me get to some of the really important concepts. So one of the concepts that I want to bring up is Stockholm syndrome. Okay, so we talked about Mary. Is she a victim? Is she a participant? Or is she somewhere in between? So Stockholm syndrome is a psychological response wherein a captive or someone who's being held captive begins to identify closely with the captors as well as with their agenda and with their demands. So the most infamous example of this is the kidnapping that involved Patty Hearst, who was the newspaper heiress to Randolph Hearst. And it was, it's a case that, I could probably do a whole other podcast on that, but it was like, was she a victim? Was she a participant? And was she somewhere in between? So Stockholm syndrome is essentially, a response where if you're susceptible to, your captor, the psychological thought behind it is that you're trying to protect yourself, right? So if you're starting to identify with your captor, there's a lot of these psychological defenses that happen, and it's for survival, right? So it's not like the victim is a victim and they're held captive, but then they kind of make the turn towards understanding their captor because psychologically it protects them. So it's very nuanced, it's very complicated. And I think that the reason why I bring it up is because Mary, is she a victim? Is she a participant? Does she have Stockholm syndrome? I mean, my honest clinical interpretation is that there is no way that Mary was interested in marrying her step grandfather. Like authentically interested. There was just no way. There were secondary gains, I believe, that led her to want to do that. Mary claimed that it was Mama's will for her to be with Robert Sr., but that is highly contested because the simple fact is that, and Razi and Mark Cazares made very good points. They said, in our religion, when you get married, it is for life. And Mama never would have married Mary and Dana, her first husband, if she wanted Mary to marry her husband. Okay. So that's a really great point. It seems that maybe I think Mary wants to believe that. I think that's maybe what Robert has said to her, to make her believe that what she's doing is appropriate or what Mama would have wanted. So I do see that there was probably some manipulation there, but at the same time, I'm wondering, where is her personal accountability in this? The other thing that I want to talk about is religious and spiritual abuse. So the most common abuse in religious institutions is an abuse of power, which leads to many forms of abuse, which can present as sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical, verbal, and financial. And this is what I'm going to focus on as I'm talking about this. Religious and spiritual abuse is really about power, control, and manipulation. Always. Those are usually the trifecta of things that you see when you have grown up in a religious or spiritually abusive environment. Okay. And religious and spiritual abuse has long lasting, very significant psychological traumatic effects. I've had people reach out to me who were raised in various religious abusive situations. And if you're listening to this, I send nothing but love, because it's so hard to recover from, because when you are manipulated at the most base level of your faith and your belief in things, it just messes with your mind so much, and it's tough to recover from. Recovery is possible, but I just send love to anyone who grew up with that. So some effects of religious abuse can be, trauma, emotional distress, loss of faith, physical self-harm, all of those things. Now, one thing I do want to bring up before I wrap the podcast up, and the only reason I'm bringing this up is because it was featured on Real Housewives of Salt Lake City season 2, before Mary skipped the reunion. So there was a gentleman that came on. His name was Cameron, and I'm not going to say his last name because unfortunately he is no longer with us. And I'm always very mindful how I speak about people who are no longer here, because they cannot speak for themselves. So I'm just going to share what he shared on TV. Which he was a church member of Mary's church that claimed he was manipulated into getting a second mortgage on his home and donating it to the church. Now, there were also allegations that he and Mary were romantically involved by Mary's mom and dad in this Up and Adam podcast. And it's funny because when they start talking about this, Mary's mom joked. She was like, good, Mary should have been with someone else, because Robert sucks, essentially. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. Okay. So one of the things that, the Bravo Docket ladies talked about that kind of leads into this whole financial abuse situation is that the IRS has special rules for churches, and it's churches are under what's called a tax exemption status. So I believe that because churches have these special rules and they're tax exempt, it increases the likelihood of financial abuse because it removes the potential of any consequences, right? If it's like, so if Mary and Robert, and Mary is the treasurer, by the way, of the church, which is hilarious. Mary is the treasurer of the church while she's like hoarding her designer handbags. And it does make you wonder, like, have funds been misappropriated? Because, it's just questionable. So if they were misappropriating funds without an audit, which essentially they're not eligible for an audit because of their tax exemption status, it would never get identified. So I just think that, humans, we need checks and balances. Some people have moral and ethical values that guide them, and some people don't. So we do need to have consequences for things. And I just think that, if there's no consequences for churches, that's how the financial abuse happens. And that's how they got away with it, I believe. It's like, taking a bunch of 6-year-olds and throwing candy in a room and being like, well, don't eat it all. And it's like, well, that's human nature. I think sometimes can be to be greedy. And, if you're getting a lot of money coming in and you're spending it on a purse or whatever, and nobody knows, I mean, what's to stop from continuing that again? So, going back to Cameron, he alleged that, Mary denied the allegation. But as I mentioned, Mama Cosby had this mortgage company that was affiliated with a church. And doesn't it make a lot of sense of maybe how initially that could have been a great business, but now could be used for something more nefarious? So this has been a lot of information, and I appreciate you all sticking with me. I hope that you've enjoyed the episode. I think this is going to have to be it for today, because I could probably talk about this for another hour, but that would be too long of a podcast. So I would like to know your thoughts. As always, please go to check out Your Bish Therapist on Instagram. I am also on TikTok. I am on, oh, you know what? I just had a thought. Okay. So for those of you who have made it to the end of this video, as a reward and a congratulations, I am going to put something out there that I want to do an episode where I get questions from listeners and from friends and from people who are listening to this. So I'm going to give out, I created an email, yourbishtherapist@gmail.com. If you would like to email me questions about whether it's this podcast or personal questions or questions about just things that you've been wondering, I may end up doing a show where I just do listener questions. So please go ahead, yourbishtherapist@gmail.com. Email me with your questions. And if I do decide to do this episode, I will, shout out people who sent the questions and things like that. So to be determined on that. So that's going to be it for me today. I just, as always, want to thank everyone so much for listening, for watching, for supporting me. I hope me thanking you doesn't get old because I'm just so overwhelmed and just so appreciative of the support. I appreciate you all very much. And, please remember to be the light in the world you want to see and take care of yourselves and each other. Until next time. Disclaimer: posts are not intended to diagnose, treat, or provide medical advice. Your Bish Therapist is for entertainment and informational purposes only. The podcast, my opinions, and posts are my own and not associated with past or present employers, any organizations, Bravo TV, Greyheart Productions, or any other television network. The information in YBT Podcast and on its social media is provided for general informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat. Please do not act or refrain from acting based on anything you read, see, or hear on YBT Podcast or associated social media. Communicating with YBT via email and or social media does not form a therapeutic alliance. Melissa, operator of YBT, is unable to provide any therapeutic advice, treatment, or feedback.